As we begin the last two modules of this class, we are in the process of taking the next leap in our understanding of all of the material we've covered up until now. So if we understand that the modern world in the 19th century started to classify everything into normal and abnormal categories and started looking for patterns in everything, almost as a form of quality control for humanity. And the 20th century saw advertising essentially jump on that bandwagon and define normal in a commodified sense to sell products that would then, quote unquote, make you normal. Then the last leap of this class is to start looking at how we individually have become part of the process and are now moving beyond the need to be externally controlled and are actually exerting that control on ourselves. So, for example, on this slide you see the famous dictum by René Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." Well, after the Gulf War started, the Second Gulf War, I'm sorry. After the Second Gulf War started, after September 11th, President Bush came on television and told the American people that the thing that they could do to support the Great War effort was to just continue consuming, shopping basically. Now, at first that seems like he was being very callous and this seems like an overly simple answer of what Americans should do. After all, we should sacrifice during a time of war, right? But he wasn't actually being flippant. He wasn't trying to be trying to make a joke out of it. Really, the best thing that we can do is consume. So in the modern iteration, if René Descartes was doing it today, it would be "I consume, therefore I am," or "I shop, therefore I am." So let's start looking at how we might have gotten to this position, okay? All right. You may have taken a psych class and run into Maslow's hierarchy of needs before. If you have not, Maslow basically came up with a pyramid of human needs that had to be met before somebody could fully actualize themselves as an individual. And this was in the heady period after World War II, where we honestly thought that we were on the cusp of something new. And you'll see it, by the way, when you see his pyramid, because so much of the basic needs of humanity had been taken care of. We didn't need anymore to be just creatures desperately trying to stay alive. So here is his hierarchy of needs. And you'll notice that starting in the second half of that pyramid, in the bottom half of it, motivation decreases as needs are met. Basically, on the most basic level, as we meet more of our needs, we work less hard. However, once we reach the top, we actually are becoming fully self-actualized people who are able to do amazing things. So Maslow's again, dream was that we would get to this point of really able to express our full individuality. And if you look at the hierarchy of needs at the bottom part, it basically says, okay, the very first thing you need is you need air, water, and food, right? Those are the most basic things. If you don't have those, nothing else matters. So that's what you need right off the bat. Next, you need safety. You need to have a place where you can put your head down at night and not worry about being eaten or killed. Okay. Above that comes the need to be loved, belonging to something, and to be held in esteem by others. And only once those most basic needs are met do we move up to that potential of being able to fully self-actualize. And if you think about it and you look at Maslow's hierarchy here, for most of human history, all we were basically doing was trying to satisfy those first two. At least most of us were. Okay, so it was just trying to get this most basic level. Today, most of us probably are not that worried about the physiological needs. Now, please don't get me wrong. I know poverty exists. I know there are real problems. But if you look at it at the most basic level, can I get 2,000 calories in me in a day? The answer is probably yes for 99.99% of the population. Calories by themselves are pretty cheap and they're abundant. So it's not that we cannot meet these needs. I didn't say it's a good diet, but just getting calories is not that difficult. Getting enough water, again, unless you live in Flint, Michigan, is not that difficult. So the physiological needs are basically being met at this point. Next comes safety. And again, we live in a society that has a safety net that does have the mechanisms in place to ensure safety for the overwhelming majority of us in most circumstances. Again, obviously it's not perfect. Obviously crime exists. Obviously there are issues. But most of us are not spending most of the day, every day, trying to stay fed and keeping some kind of protection so that we don't die in the middle of the night. That then takes us to our next levels. And this is where the 19th and 20th centuries come into Maslow's hierarchy because, well, let's take a look at it. First thing we need is love and belonging. Now, having done the advertising, you'll notice that commodification is where this comes in, where this gets taken care of. So, for example, Coca-Cola, open a Coke, open happiness. So I am happy if I'm drinking Coca-Cola. Obviously, that's a ludicrous statement, but you can see how we are being fed this line. And again, materialism sort of takes care of this need for us. Virginia Slims, you've come a long way, baby. A feminine identity in the 1970s created by smoking. The more you smoked Virginia Slims, the more independent you were as a woman, the more loved and accepted you were in your identity. Our favorite, the halitosis one of Listerine. Again, are you unpopular with your own children? So the idea that, again, love and happiness at home was contingent on having this product to take care of your love and belonging. And then finally, look at this Budweiser ad from the 1980s. The three women are basically making the label for the Budweiser beer, and essentially, hey, if you drink Budweiser, then you will have the love and belonging of being part of this group and be accepted by society. So you can see how the love and belonging need that Maslow identified is being commodified. Now we come up to esteem, and we can see that even that is being commodified. Unrivaled for enduring worth. Look at the model that General Motors came up with. The reason General Motors became the largest car corporation in the world at its time was because it set up brands for every single level of social attainment. So somebody would start off their life with a Chevrolet and end their life with a Cadillac. At each point, they would know how they were stacked up against everyone else, how much esteem they had in the society based on where they were on the material ladder that General Motors had provided for them. Here's another one from Ford, again showing that you are accepted, you are a man, you are a working person, you are held in esteem as a working person. Mike Rowe, the man featured in this ad, does a program on TV where, again, he emphasizes the worth, the value of work. And so you are held in esteem if you have a job. And the way you show that is by driving a Ford F-150 pickup truck. Okay. So we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs being essentially commodified by advertisers. Now we get to the very top of Maslow's hierarchy. And at the top of Maslow's hierarchy is the idea of self-actualization. That is when you achieve your true self. This is the idea that once you have taken care of all those other needs, you can start to develop a true sense of self, a true sense of identity, a person, a real personhood. Okay? That's Maslow's version of it. Here's the postmodern version of self-actualization. It is heavily commodified because now it's not just commodified by products, it's also commodified by ideologies. And it's not just ideologies on one side, there's ideologies on the other side as well. And of course, the whole concept of identity gets commodified as well. So again, in this case, there's a product being commodified, but also an entire identity that's being commodified with it. We only exist within the commodified sphere. I know my success because I drive X car. I know my identity because I am replicating such and such identity that exists in hyperspace or hyperreality. Okay? So, how do we get to this point? How does this differ from the past? How does it differ from Maslow's sense of true self? Well, let's take a look at the metaphors that we use. Metaphors are an interesting subject, okay? Robert Frost once said that the only teacher that is worth a damn is a metaphor. And in the case of a metaphor, the reason it works is because the connection is made by the person perceiving the metaphor. So, for example, you may know the famous line from Forrest Gump where he says, "Life is like a box of chocolates." Now, the intention of that metaphor is that life is full of choices. But if you say life is like a box of chocolates to a diabetic, it comes across as a completely different meaning than it does to someone who's non-diabetic. Or if you do it for an alcoholic, it has a completely different meaning. The meaning of the metaphor is in the person perceiving it. That's a key component that you should keep in mind as we start looking at metaphors here. The metaphor that we're going to start off with is the metaphor that existed for almost the entirety of human history from the Greeks onward. And it was something called the Great Chain of Being. The metaphor was of a chain. Keep that in mind. At the very top of the chain was God, gods, whatever you want to put there. And at the very bottom of the chain was everything else. And it just kept going down until you got to the bugs, to the lowest forms of life. Every single living thing was on that chain, including the social classes of humanity. So, for example, a king was on a higher level than a peasant. A man was on a higher level than a woman. The idea was that those lower on the chain owed obedience to those higher on the chain. However, those higher on the chain owed love to the lower parts of the chain. Every single link on the chain was equally important because the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So yes, you might be a peasant, but your place in the chain was as important as that of the king or of God because you represented the link in the chain, and if it was gone, then the whole chain would collapse. There is no social mobility in this chain. Links cannot change their place in the chain. However, there is also security in it because you can never lose your place in the chain. For most of us, this metaphor is wildly discomforting because we can't imagine a place where there is simply no such thing as social mobility, where all of a sudden everything is that you must obey those above you, even if they are wrong. And by the way, this chain took into consideration, so for example, things like tyranny, or let's take an example of a man and a woman. if a man owed a woman love, she owed him obedience, and which, by the way, is still in some of the traditional marriage vows. So if you go to a traditional wedding, you'll hear the bride say, "Love, honor, and obey," and while the husband says, "Love, honor, and protect." Okay, so that's a holdover from this great chain of being. For us, it is, as I said, wildly discomforting because we just can't accept this idea. Identity is tied to your position and your duties. They don't change. This is it. This is what you're going to be for the rest of your life. This is your fixed position in the world. You don't have to ask yourself, who am I, or what am I going to do, or any of these questions, because they're built in. Obviously, this is very problematic for us. Here's our modern metaphor in the United States, the American dream. But that dream is completely amorphous. How do you know you've achieved it? What are you supposed to achieve? Is your dream supposed to be the same as my dream? How are we supposed to know where we're supposed to be on this thing? It seems to be wildly individualistic. It seems to be always one step away. You must do something else to achieve your dream. So again, you may look at someone like Elon Musk and ask yourself, why is this person still going to work? What is the point? They've achieved everything. And the answer is, the dream always has yet one more step to go. Defined and redefined by discourse. Your position on this on this dream is always left open to reinterpretation by society. So looking at some of our historical figures who have achieved success on this, now we look at them as monsters. Okay, it's not that you will always be accepted. So imagine that, again, as a young person, you're sitting there and someone older tells you that the future is in plastics. This is a famous line from the movie The Graduate. Okay, the future is in plastics, but that doesn't mean anything to you. You don't want to achieve this dream. You have your own dream. And of course, this leads to generational conflicts. It leads to individual conflicts. It leads to relationship conflicts. It leads to all kinds of things. Okay? So the metaphor, to a large extent, controls how we view the world. Let's go on to the next slide here. In a sense, this creates a paradox of choice. Why is it a paradox? Well, because maybe that choice isn't as real as we like to think it is. So, for example, you have the freedom to wear whatever clothes you want to, but we've already talked about that it's not quite as free as you want to be, right? Because there is always the gaze of those around you, which controls the discourse of what is and is not acceptable. If you wear the wrong clothes, and it's not accepted by society, then you will be gazed upon or possibly shunned. The same is for language and other things. So again, as each generation reinvents the language, it seems like they're taking ownership of it and they are expressing themselves, but in fact, they are still being controlled. And obviously, discourse really doesn't work that way, because discourse is this big eye that tells us what we can and can't do. And of course, if we ever run cross of that eye, the eye of everyone around us, the eye of society, we become invisible. And being invisible is the most terrifying thing in the world. A good way of illustrating this is to take something that is from our history, but that really helps to illustrate what I mean by the paradox of choice. Let's talk about the hobo. Now, hobo is a word that nowadays is just basically synonymous with homeless person, but it didn't start off that way. Here's the definition of hobo from the Urban Dictionary. Originally referred to poor, homeless, itinerant workers in the USA. These original hobos traveled from town to town seeking temporary employment, usually along the lines of physical labor. They're traditionally associated with freight hopping. See also drifter, vagabond, and okie. Let's skip the definition for a second. Traditional hobos are often romanticized in popular culture. For example, in the books of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck and On the Road by Jack Kerouac and the music of Woody Guthrie. So the hobo used to be a romantic figure. It used to be somewhat acceptable to check out of society and essentially live on the road, making your way the best you could. The images of the hobo carrying a guitar, not a care in the world, getting a job, working for a few days, making ends meet, then moving on to the next place, and just constantly traveling. Nowadays, commonly used throughout the English-speaking world to refer to any homeless person. See also bum, tramp, and beggar. The portrayal of modern homeless people, however, is usually much less favorable, with a widespread belief that homelessness is self-inflicted and that these bums should just get jobs. So basically, what choice do you have if you choose not to fit into the discourse of society? Will you be seen in the traditional romantic vision of the hobo, or will you be seen as a bum? Here is the image. This is from the 1930s of the hobo. Again, hopping on trains, traveling across America. When I was in grad school, one of my professors did this every single summer. This was how he traveled. He kept a credit card in his shoe, and whenever his driver's license and his credit card in his shoe, and whenever he got tired of being on that train, he would go to the nearest airport and hop a flight back home. But this he did for his sanity. It was for his well-being. It was a way of getting in touch with the world out there. That's the traditional image of the hobo. How did we get from that to this? The automatic assumption of anybody who's homeless is that they're mentally ill, that they're drug addicted, and that they're a scourge on society that must be controlled. And of course, that brings great fear to us, because if you let yourself fall into this, then there must be something wrong with you, and you have failed in society. You must become invisible. Okay. Are we really free to make any choice with our life? Are we really free to explore whatever discourse route we want to? And if you look at the articles for this section, you'll notice that the general sense of sadness among young people today is largely tied to the expectations we put on them. We don't have as much freedom as we would like to think we do. Put into a broader philosophical standpoint, we get to something called postmodernism. Postmodernism is an intellectual stance or mode of discourse defined by an attitude of skepticism towards what it considers as the grand narratives and ideologies of modernism. Grand narratives like your religious calling, freedom in the American sense, communism in the Soviet sense, nationalism in the modern sense of populism, whatever it is, these ideologies, as well as opposition to epistemic certainty. Epistemic means understanding of meaning. And the idea here is that, hey, whatever meaning you think something has been imposed on it by you. Remember when we discussed music, and I mentioned that music could be interpreted differently when you take the exact same song and switch genres. So if you hear Johnny Cash's version of Hurt, it's about an old man looking back on his life with regret. If you hear Nine Inch Nails' version of Hurt, which is the exact same song lyrically, with the change of one single word, it's about drug addiction and the self-destruction of a drug habit. Okay? So obviously, meaning is not stable. It's in the genre. It's in how we interpret it or what categories we put it into. Claims to objective fact are dismissed as naive realism. Postmodernism is characterized by self-referentiality, i.e. constantly making references to ourselves. So for example, for all of you who make pop culture references to understand everything. This is what where it comes from. Epistemological relativism, nothing means anything. Moral relativism, there is no right or wrong. It's open to interpretation. Your right may very well be someone else's wrong. Pluralism, I'm okay, you're okay. Irony, irreverence, and eclecticism. It rejects the universal validity of binary oppositions, stable identity, hierarchy, and categorization. If that's not the perfect description of the world we live in right now, I don't know what is. Now, mind you, this also creates its own issues. So let's look at this final slide. Once you start stripping people into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller identities, you end up with a universe of a single one. Basically, we become a balloon floating freely, and we become completely untethered. Because when it's all is said and done, everything becomes more and more abstract. The ability to establish meaningful groups becomes more and more strained. A world of binaries becomes multipolar. So again, we talked about balkanization, the idea of the binary and how that tears itself apart, and you start getting more and more. And again, the binaries become more and more contradictory internally. So for example, take an American conservative or liberal viewpoint and look at how many contradictions are built into either one of them. They cannot support themselves. They start falling apart the minute you start picking at these contradictions, because essentially you have to accept these contradictions. In a sense, this goes back to what we talked about when we talked about discourse, and I mentioned that there is a inherent contradiction to the idea of wealth in America, for example. America is a materialistic society. We believe that the more material success you achieve, the more you should be held in esteem. It sort of can be summarized in this saying, he who dies with the most toys wins, right? But at the same time, we come from a religious background where it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven. And so to make those two huge contradictions work together, and I know some of you are right now sitting there going, but, to make those contradictions work, we have to come up with all kinds of mental gymnastics that says, okay, you're not being really materialistic if you do the following, or you can be materialistic under these circumstances, or maybe the moral tale of the camel through the eye of a needle didn't consider this particular, however you want to justify it. These are contradictions, and yet we make them work together. So at the end of it, multipolar becomes more fragmented, and we are left with an individualism that is not individualistic. Again, I think I'm being myself, I'm being my true self, going back to Maslow's hierarchy at the very top, right? I am being my one true self, but that one true self is in fact full of contradictions, full of reactions to the discourse around me, and full of those forces telling me what is and is not acceptable. As you start doing this last two papers, remember the final paper is a research paper, and you can pick the topic and you can look at the development of one identity and how that works, and feel free to ask me about it. You're looking at that, and then on the third paper, you're going to be again looking at you've got the assignment. You're looking at how past advertising, past balkanization, we go out of our way to constrain ourselves and put ourselves in boxes through things like social media and all of the other mechanisms that we've created in our society. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I would be happy to answer them. And I hope this is useful for you. Have a great day.